We continue our parables series, but we're up to Matthew 24. And Matthew 24 is one of the key teachings about the end times. And in my sermon, we'll go a bit of a detail. What does end times really mean? Because people have different understandings. Now, there's parables that Jesus will use as part of this end time teaching to try and remind us of the importance of the event and the certainty of the event. Now, it's interesting, in Matthew 24, as we come to it, we'll find that Jesus actually blends two questions together. So when people talk about the return of Christ and Judgment Day, they normally think of it as in the future. But in the New Testament, it actually looked at two key events. The first of Judgment Day and the end time was actually the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Jerusalem is Israel's capital city. It's the center of their Jewish sacrificial system. Their worship was based on the temple. It's the focal point of festivals, of the priesthood, of learning. Everything happened in Jerusalem. So to destroy Jerusalem was to destroy life itself. So that's the first thing that Scripture regularly looks at. Now, why is this so important? Because the destruction of the temple showed the end of the old covenant thinking. We talk about Old Testament, New Testament. Old Testament, Old Covenant. New Testament, New Covenant. So the New Testament, Jesus, is a whole new way of doing everything. Now, many people, modern times, would believe that Jesus died AD 33. And between AD 33 and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, you had the Old Covenant standing right beside the New Covenant in Jerusalem. You had people who were worshipping, loving Jesus, saved by grace, while others were going to the temple day by day. So the two happens together. Now it's interesting, in Matthew 24 verse 17 it says this: "Let the one who's on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who's in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant, for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or in the Sabbath." You say, well, how would you pray, "Dear God, don't come back on a Saturday," or "Jesus, please don't come back in winter," because is that Northern Hemisphere winter or Southern Hemisphere winter? So those verses there obviously refer to the destruction of Jerusalem, not to Jesus' return. So the second thing we have is Jesus' return, which is quite now for us the most important one. Now the problem with some of the passages is that we will come with our own presuppositions when we read them. And Matthew 24 is a classic example of that. So what do we find at the beginning of Matthew 24 there in verse 1? It says that Jesus left the temple. With his disciples came to point out to him the beauty of the buildings. So imagine the disciples saying, "Oh, Jesus, look at the stonework there. Oh, look at that marble. Now look at this path." They were captured by the buildings. But Jesus says this: "You see all these things, don't you? Truly I say to you that not one will be left here, one stone upon another. They'll all be thrown down." He then sat down on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us when these things will take place." First question. "And what will be the signs of your coming?" Second question. "And the end of the age?" Third question. But is the end of the age them seeing the two happening at once, or seeing the two things happening at separate times? So disciples actually ask him two separate questions. Now as Jesus answers, he blends answers about the temple and answers about his return. And we need to separate the two from each other. So the term "the end of the world" is one of the key ones that's used about Jesus' return. And literally means the end of the age or the end of an era. Now for some, the end of an era could be the end of the Mosaic era, AD 70. Others say it's the end of the world the day Jesus comes back. So Jews recognise two ages. They talk about they lived in the Mosaic age and the age to come. Now the term "last days" could refer to the Mosaic age. So you can see why some of these verses suddenly become a bit more complex to understand. So how can you do it? What are your presuppositions you might come with? As you come to Matthew 24, there are some people around who say everything in Matthew 24 was fulfilled AD 70. There are some Christians who say Jesus will never come back because he came back in AD 70. And so the world that we have today will be here forever. It will never end. There'll be no future coming of Jesus. They're a very rare group, but they do exist. The second group will come to Matthew 24 and say, everything here is future tense from today. So 2019, these things are going to happen in our future, had not already happened. The third way you do it is to say, some of these verses are fulfilled by Jerusalem and the destruction. Others will be fulfilled by Jesus' return. And the fourth way, which I lean most towards, is that the end times are going to talk about different types and different things that will happen. And those things will happen over and over again. I'll give you one example. When it says there are going to be false Christs, there have been false Christs in every generation for the last 1900 years. Will there be a major false Christ at the end of all time? That is quite a strong possibility. But it's talking about the fact that wherever we as Christians live, there will be heresy, there will be false Christs, there will be people who will try and lead us astray. So as we look at all these things that talk about end times, how should we respond? Do the wars, false Christs, and the other signs show that Jesus is about to return? I want to look at two key verses. The first one is verse 8 there in chapter 24. When it looks at the things like false Christs and famines and whatever, it says this: all these are but the beginning of birth pains. I remember the great fun I had of driving my daughter-in-law each time to the hospital to give birth to our 4 grandkids. And I remember once getting there and she went in and said, I'm about to give birth. And of course the nurse who knows all things, because she's seen 1,000 babies, said, oh no, you just sit there, you're all okay. Because she just knew that all mums come way, way too early. And so about half an hour later she gets to her, and her first comment says, oh my gosh, you're about to give birth, what are you doing here? You should be in a bed. Because my daughter-in-law pops me out like that. Matter of fact, the last one, I think, got born about 10 o'clock at night. She said, can I just go home? And they made her stay overnight in the hospital. She was very upset. She said, I've given birth, I'm okay, just go home. I'm done. I think from woe to go, from me picking her up to baby being born was maybe 2-3 hours. So you're not talking about a fast thing. So what's this saying here? All these are but the beginning of birth pains. And so what can we say? As the nurse would say, oh, don't you worry about it, you've got heaps of time. What about this one in verse 6? And you'll hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet. So one of the key things it's saying is, these are realities of our world, but that doesn't mean Jesus is around the corner. There's other things that may point this way. Or as it says in verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So we're going to look at some of these key things of what they say and say, when did these things happen? So when could you say the gospel was proclaimed to the whole world? And Jesus answered what I'm going to do is, at each of these things, we're going to say, has it happened AD 70? Has it happened in history? Is it going to happen in the future? So the first one to look at is verse 4 and verse 5 says, there will be false Christs, false messiahs, false religious leaders who set themselves up as an alternative to Jesus. It's interesting when you think about it, some of the modern heresies, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, they've been around for less than 200 years. Other heresies have been around for 50 years, things like the Moonies. So what's it say there in verse 4-5? See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. In AD 70, what was it like then? There were many Christs in Jerusalem. Matter of fact, there were 3 main messiahs that took different sections of Jerusalem, and the Jews in the Jerusalem spent as much time fighting each other as they did spend fighting the Romans. So messiahs were there right from the word go. Has there been false teachers in every age since then? Yes, there has. What about the future? Now, when the Reformation movement, Protestant movement first started, everybody was very clear and very conscious that the false Christ, the false Messiah, false religion was the Roman Catholic Church. Now, as we look towards the coming of Jesus, we may find other false religions come to the forefront in a very, very powerful way. How will that look? I don't know. But every age will have its false teachers, and I think the last age will happen in a very significant way. How it would look? I don't know, because it's prophecy. And prophecy regularly, you become an expert after it happens, not beforehand. Now, it's interesting, at the time of Jesus and the time of the early church, in the book of Acts, one of the people mentioned is a guy called Felix. And it says that the Jews had so many false messiahs and impostors that Felix was putting one of the false teachers to death every day. Gives you an idea of how many false teachers were there in the early church. The next thing it says in verse 6 is there'll be wars, and you'll hear of wars and rumours of wars. So in AD 70, were there wars? Before the fall of Jerusalem, 4 emperors on the Roman Empire had come to violent deaths within a period of 18 months. And you can understand how this distress would have gone right through the whole Roman Empire and right through the feeling of Jerusalem. Now, what's happening in Israel? In Israel at that time, in one area, 50,000 Jews were killed in one military uprising. Another uprising against Alexandria. There's a battle between Jews and Syrians, and at Caesarea, another 20,000 were killed. Now, during these times, Caligula ordered that his statue be placed in the Temple of Jerusalem. The Jews refused to do this and lived in constant fear that the emperor's armies would be sent into Palestine. So you can see that the idea of wars and rumours of wars were there at the beginning. Has been wars and rumours of wars since then. Every era since then has had it. What about the future? There is a good chance that we might have a World War III. There's a good chance there'll be some type of destructive event will happen as part of the return of Jesus next time round. So what is it we've got there with wars? It's a type that has reality in the early church, in every age since, and in the end times. That will never go. The United Nations, one of their big desires is to create peace. And what has happened since the United Nations has happened? Hundreds of wars. If I said to you at morning tea, can you name me a country that has not been at war in the last 50 years? You can nearly count them on 2 hands. Actually, probably 3 hands. If you've got 3 hands with 2 hands with 6 fingers. I think there's 17 countries in the world that have not seen war since 1945. But what is our response to these wars? How should we deal with crises? Verse 6. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. So if World War III comes, doesn't mean Jesus is about to return now. It is just a preliminary sign. Why? In verse 7, nation will rise against nation and kingdom will rise against kingdom. The third thing they look at is famines. So it says there will be famines. Now in AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem, what was happening in the early church? If you read the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 11, it says, throughout the world in the days of Claudius Caesar, there was a famine. And Judea was especially hit very hard, to the point that we find the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians and Romans organises a collection of money for Jerusalem to help the famine victims. Has there been famine ever since then? Yes. Is there famine today? Yes. And do you realise how easy it would be to feed the starving people in our world? If all the government said, what we're going to do is set one day aside a year where we spend no money on military, and one day military expenditure will be spent on food for the starving people, that one day of military expenditure feeds everyone. And you think that's like 0.3% of their military world's budget. And do the governments do it? No. Because by heart we are sinful people. It's our sinful nature that stops our generosity. The fourth thing it talks about is earthquakes. It says there'll be earthquakes in various places. So what happened in the early church? AD 63 in the city of Pompeii. Massive earthquake. Massive destruction. to the point that we talk about the earthquake in Pompeii today. And it's really featured in specials and documentaries and TV shows all the time. What other earthquakes had they had at that time that were quite significant? In Crete, Apamea, Smyrna, Miletus, Chios, Samos and Judea all had major earthquakes. Has there been earthquakes throughout history? Yes. Are there earthquakes today? Yes. Will earthquakes be there in the end times? Yes. But I think in the end times, we may find they will happen in a more significant way than even today. The fifth thing that's brought out about the end times is there'll be persecution of Christians. So there in verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. If you read through the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul spends most of his life in prison for being a Christian. The church was persecuted. Every age since then, the church has been persecuted. It's believed that more Christians have been killed in the last 100 years than all Christian history before then. Persecution is part of the Christian walk. And it's fascinating, in response to what's happened in New Zealand, I've been intrigued by the amount of people who've put up horrific stories of mass murders by Muslims of Christians worldwide. It's a daily event. There's one website that just lists all the attacks on Christians every day by Muslims. And so far this year, you're looking at hundreds of times, and tens of thousands of Christians have been killed. Does that negate what happened in New Zealand? No, because terror is always terror. For me as a Christian, I have a lot that I'm willing to die for and nothing I'm willing to kill for. We as Christians are never called to terrorism. We are called to love our neighbour as we love ourselves. We're called to have a heart of compassion and mercy. What should our response be to terrorism? Prayer, mercy, love, compassion. The sixth response in terms of the end times is people will lose faith. There in verse 10. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. In terms of false prophets, it says in verse 11, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. In terms of lawlessness in verse 12, and because lawlessness will increase, love will grow cold. The love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Sadly, there are churches today that really do not proclaim Christ. There are churches who will talk about self-help courses or feel-goods, and the sermons can be quite pleasant, but they're not teaching Scripture. And we need to examine ourselves and say, am I a person of God's Word? Do I spend time reading His Scriptures? Am I desiring to put God first in my decision-making? Now the next one is that the gospel will be preached throughout the whole world. So there in verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And you say, well, I wonder, has the gospel been proclaimed to the whole world? And we go to the book of Acts. The book of, we talked about Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. It says that on that day, devout men out of every nation under heaven. And so there'll be some Christians saying, look at that, on the day of Pentecost, the gospel went to the whole world because people from the whole world were there. Or as it says in Romans 1:8, your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. Or Colossians 1:6, the gospel has come to you as it has gone to the whole world. Or Colossians 1:23, the gospel which you have heard, which was preached to every creature which is under heaven. And so there's a sense that right from the very beginning, the whole Roman Empire and parts beyond were covered by gospel preachers. And one of their passions was for the gospel to go forth. Now these verses of sending the gospel to the whole world undergirded our whole modern missionary movement. So if you were a missionary and lived in England, you were happy to go to darkest Africa because you felt that Jesus wanted you to go. You would go to the darkest and hardest places because you felt this strong Christ sense on your life. I've had the privilege to even have, say, in our house, some missionaries who felt called to go to garbage dumps. And you're kind of thinking, why would you do that? Because some garbage dumps can have 30,000 people living on the garbage dump. And you're kind of thinking, dear God, I'm sure there's a middle class suburb you want me to go to. And I had the privilege years ago of providing all the scripture resources for the Garbage Dump Sunday School in Cairo. Thousands have come to know Jesus through the ministry of the church that meets in a tip. Imagine if we said, Kimbrickie Presbyterian Church, our local tip. So, gospel to the whole world. Evangelism Explosion was quite excited with the day that every country in the world had a EE representative, because it represented the gospel to the whole world. What should that mean to you and I? We need to share the gospel to the whole world today, as every generation before us and every generation after us. Now we come to the first of the parables, and it's called the budding fig tree, there in verse 32 to 35 of chapter 24. Now in chapter 32 it says, now learn this lesson from the fig tree. Now last week we learned that the vine was a symbol of Israel's spiritual privileges. The olive tree is a symbol of Israel's religious privileges, but the fig tree is a symbol of Israel's national privileges. So it's national pride. And it says here in this parable, as soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Now, what's it talking about with that generation? They would see the destruction of Jerusalem, not the return of Christ. So there in Matthew 24:2, he answered, there will be not left here one stone upon another, they will all be thrown down. Then in verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So what is our response to the return of Jesus? Verse 36, but about that hour and day no one knows. We do know it will be sudden and it will be unexpected. Then in verse 40, 2 men will be in a field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken, the other left. Now people debate who's taken and who's left in terms, is the righteous taken or is it the ungodly who are taken? Is the righteous left, the ungodly left? And it's an interesting debate, but doesn't lead us anywhere, because the true essence is there is a day of judgment. Every single person here in Newport will give an account of their life to God. Do we stand there and say, I'm here, God, because Jesus died for me? I can bring you nothing but my sins and his forgiveness. And then God says, good and faithful servant, come on in. I've prepared a place for you. Now it's interesting, the next thing we have is called the faithful servant in verse 42 to 51. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day the Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would have not left his house to be broken into. So you must also be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour that you will not expect. We as Christians are called to be ready, and what is our sign of being ready? That we are living holy lives. We have a passion for the gospel. That holy living is the core value of who we are. Being ready doesn't mean you're out there picking dates. Being ready is living a godly life. Then verse 45, who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? It would be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. And we as Christians are called to be living godly lives till the day he comes back. But then gives the contrast in verse 47. Truly I tell you, he'll put him in charge of all his possessions, but suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying a long time, and be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So what do we have here? The strong sense that we as Christians need to be ready for Christ, to be passionate about his return and holy to that day. Let's just bow our heads in prayer.